Kathy Jean Thomas was born December 13, 1953, and was the youngest of 3 girls born to Leo and Jessie Thomas of Oklahoma. When her parents divorced, her father Leo brought Kathy from Oklahoma to Roseburg, Oregon. She was sadly separated from her 2 older sisters, Sandra and Linda, who were eventually adopted by another family when their parents abandoned them. Kathy lived a horrible childhood with her father and would go with very little food to the point where she would show up at the landlord's house looking for some. Eventually, the landlord, Eileen Buxton, offered her father $5,000 to adopt 5-year-old Kathy, which he accepted. Sadly, Eileen was diagnosed with cancer when Kathy was 16 and passed away, leaving her very vulnerable. She then met and married 18-year-old Carl Tracy after becoming pregnant. Within a year, Kathy's first daughter, Tina, was born and she and Carl would divorce. A few months later, she entered her second marriage with James Jug Gardner, with whom she had 2 more children, James Jr. and Candace. She soon divorced Gardner, took the kids, and moved to Oklahoma. She would then leave her children in her mother's care for unknown reasons. Her mother turned the children over to the state and they were placed with adopted families. Eventually, they were all adopted by families in Oklahoma, with Tina being adopted to a family by herself. Once her kids were taken away, Kathy moved to Portland, where she met and married Brian Clifton in 1984. They settled in the Salem area, and Kathy's last contact with anyone was in March 1996 when she reported a hit-and-run accident to Salem police. 6 months later, on September 1, 1996, her remains were discovered, although it would take over 20 years for the remains to be identified as Kathy's. Her husband strangely never reported her missing, and her children had no idea she had even disappeared. When her body was discovered, it was wrapped in a tarp and bound with rope in an area overlooking Mill Creek, about 20 miles west of Salem in the Polk County hills, but no one knew her identity at the time. By analyzing her hip bones, they were able to determine that she had given birth at least once. The analysis also revealed that the Jane Doe had a cranial surgery at some point and was in her early 40s. However, because just the bones were discovered, the investigators were not able to figure out the cause of death or any other details. They did find some men's underwear that would eventually be used to produce DNA. Meanwhile, her husband Clifton quickly moved on, remarried a month later, and had a son and would later move out of the state. Over the next 2 decades, investigators continued to make efforts to learn the woman's identity using sketches, CT scans, 3D rendered images, and even using the actual skull to create sculptures. In 2018, retired Las Vegas crime scene investigator Yolanda McClary embarked on a lengthy journey to figure out who the Jane Doe was. She contacted Dr. Nikki Vance, the state's forensic anthropologist, who included the case on a list of unidentified remains she thought could be potential investigations for the show The Jane Doe Murders on Oxygen. The network spent about $150,000 on DNA analyses for a total of 10 cold case victims from across the country. Analysts then used the DNA data to carry out genetic genealogy investigations. McClary and 2 genealogists teamed up to trace the family tree that led them to believe the Jane Doe remains belonged to Kathy. McClary and Polk County investigators then tracked down Kathy's sister, Linda Amsler, in Oklahoma and asked if she had a sister she hadn't seen in years. Through DNA tests, it was confirmed that the Jane Doe was in fact Kathy Thomas Clifton. Upon investigating her last husband, Brian Clifton, it was determined that he was previously convicted of murder in 1973 in Multnomah County. Records show he told detectives at the time that he had killed a Portland motel clerk and he served 6 years in prison. This occurred prior to his marriage to Kathy, and it is unknown if she was ever aware of his violent history. Clifton was eventually tracked down in Shawnee, Oklahoma in December of 2020, living with an elderly woman. He was interviewed multiple times over a several-month period. In August of 2021, the Polk County grand jury heard the case and indicted Clifton for the murder of Kathy. After being arrested, he admitted to murdering her. Kathy's children now know what happened to their mother. Her oldest daughter, Tina, now works as a caseworker for the state child welfare agency. She didn't know what had happened to her mother until a couple years ago when the detectives from Oregon arrived at her younger sister's home in Oklahoma and delivered the news. She said investigators approached her sister, Candace Thomas, about 2 months after they contacted Kathy's sister. Kathy's son, James Edwards, now lives in Texas, and along with his sisters, they never knew if their mother was alive or deceased. They had also never met their aunt, even though they only lived an hour away from each other. They happily met in August 2021. 25 years after the murder of Kathy, 68-year-old Brian Clifton was arraigned on first-degree murder on September 7, 2021. He is currently lodged in the Polk County Jail. Thankfully, Kathy finally has her name back, and her kids now have closure. On March 27, 1961, a young teen boy ran away from home and began hitchhiking. He would be picked up in rural Alabama on Highway 25 in Bibb County by a man named James White. A short time later, White would strike a guardrail near River Bend Bridge, causing the vehicle to go over and land in the murky Cahaba River below. The driver survived, but sadly, the boy didn't. The boy's remains were recovered from the river, but authorities didn't know who he was or if anyone was looking for him. He had told the driver he ran away from home after his parents separated because he was worried that he would have to live in an orphanage or join the Navy if he stayed at home. He didn't say what his specific destination was, and he wasn't in the car long enough to give the driver more details. The two travelers hadn't even exchanged names before the crash, and he became known as the Bibb County John Doe. His body remained in the morgue for about 2 weeks while investigators attempted to identify him. After not being able to identify him or locate his family, he was buried in the Centerville Memorial Cemetery on Mill Street with money raised and donated by the community for the funeral. The headstone read, "Unknown in life but recognized in death." He was wearing a Timex watch and carrying a suitcase full of clothing, but no identification was located. However, there was a photograph of he and an unidentified girl. He also had a pack of Pall Mall cigarettes with a South Carolina tax stamp on it, indicating he may have traveled some distance before ending up in Alabama. In 2016, authorities were contacted by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and learned that the agency was providing money to pay for the exhumation of the body. They wanted to examine the remains in hopes of using modern technology to identify him. The remains were taken to the Alabama Department of Forensic Science for preparation. There, a pathologist would examine the body and take bone and teeth fragments. They were then sent to researchers at the University of North Texas in an attempt to get DNA. However, they couldn't find any DNA on the outside perimeter of the bone, so they sat in North Texas. Just a month after C.W. West was elected Bibb County Coroner in October 2020, he was contacted by Colleen Fitzpatrick, who was the founder of Identifinders International and a pioneer in the use of forensic genealogy. They talked about again examining the boy's remains, but it would be a costly task. It was then that West remembered that the former coroner had sent what samples they had to the University of North Texas, and Fitzgerald and West were able to obtain those samples. Experts in Salt Lake City performed a tissue laser process where the bone fragments and 3 teeth were pulverized and then sent to another lab in California. They did extensive work there to extract DNA, and despite having a lot of complications, they did not give up. It was a lengthy process, but ultimately, they were able to finally obtain the DNA. Coroner West said a team of genealogists using DNA from the 2016 exhumation of the body confirmed the remains to be those of 15-year-old Daniel Paul Danny Armantrout. According to Identifinders International, Danny's identification represents the oldest case of a National Center for Missing and Exploited Children subject ever solved by genetic genealogy. They learned Danny was born December 28, 1945 in Miami, Florida. His parents, Alfred Armantrout and Virginia Berner, had divorced when Danny was young, and his mother had remarried another man with the last name Hamilton. The team of genetic genealogists then tracked down a cousin who was living in Germany and vaguely remembered Danny. Eventually, they found one of Danny's brothers, aged 77, who was living in Florida. At the time Danny had run away, this brother was in the U.S. Army. Investigators learned Danny's mother and stepfather had moved to Tennessee at some point with her 3 sons, including Danny. However, it wasn't a happy home for the boys. When he returned home from the Army and learned that Danny had run away, he did not know where to look for him or how to find him. Shortly after Danny had run away, the 3rd brother did the same thing. That brother has never been heard from family since then. If he's still alive, he would be 79 years old now and may have gone by the last name of Hamilton. The surviving brother believes Danny was trying to hitchhike from Tennessee to California to enlist in the Army. Danny's father was born in 1910 in Georgia and died in Georgia in 1973. His mother was born September 2, 1921 in New Jersey and died in Florida on February 22, 2011. Identifinders International now plans to help try to find Danny's other brother who also ran away. In the meantime, more than 60 years later, a headstone bearing Danny's name will be added to his gravesite in Centerville that reads Daniel Paul Armantrout. Debbie Triantis Hawk and David Hawk would marry in 1991 and while living in Lemoore, California, would have 3 children, Conrad, Chelsea, and Savannah. In 2000, after 9 years of marriage, the couple would divorce. At the time of the divorce, the children were 4, 8, and 9 years old. Debbie, who was described as a wonderful mother and a hard worker with a great sense of humor, worked as a pharmaceutical rep and appeared much happier after her divorce from David. She bought a home in Hanford, California, and shared visitation of the children with David. She told her sister that David had once tried to choke her and said that if anything were to happen to her, that she knew where to look. Even the oldest son, Conrad, reported his dad often threatened his mother. On June 13, 2006, Debbie didn't arrive to pick up the children from David's home, so he dropped them off at her place without checking with her first. When the children, aged 15, 14, and 10, went inside, their 46-year-old mother was missing. Found inside was a blood trail from her bedroom to the garage, and the house was a mess. It appeared that she was dragged out of the house against her will, and police believed a burglary was staged. Also, the neighbors reported hearing a very loud scream the night before, between 1 and 2 a.m., but did not call police or check on her. When police called David to come to the police department after 2 a.m., hours after the children found their mother missing, he didn't even ask why. His alibi was that he was home with the children at the time the crime would have taken place. 2 days later, her van was located abandoned in a high-crime area of Fresno, California on Bird Avenue, 40 miles from her home, with more blood on the back seat. The windows were down, with the keys in the ignition, and the license plate had been replaced with a stolen one. However, Debbie was nowhere to be found. Police believe that the condition of the van was a ruse, an attempt to plant blame somewhere else. In the months prior to Debbie's disappearance, David asked the courts for reduction in his child support payments, stating that he only earned $6,000 a year working for his father on an almond farm. However, he lived in a nice home and drove a late model Suburban. The two also battled over custody arrangements, and Debbie believed he was stealing money from the children's trust funds set up by his father. This was the second set of trust funds because he had allegedly stolen all of the money out of the first sets. The second set had $100,000 in each, totaling $300,000, but very little was left in each. He had allegedly been living off the money for 5 years and even bought his girlfriend a Lexus and took her on vacation to Hawaii. Debbie was planning to expose all of this in court before she disappeared. When police searched his home, they found a stun gun he purchased a month prior to Debbie's disappearance, but no hard evidence he had harmed her. Their son Conrad recalled his father and his girlfriend Mary toasting to wine on the patio the night after the incident. Mary was well known to the family as she babysat the children prior to Debbie and David's divorce. During the investigation, even Mary told police that he said numerous times that he was not going to stop with the custody fight until Debbie was dead. Even without a body, Hawk was later found guilty of first-degree murder. Prosecutors secured the conviction based on circumstantial evidence showing Hawk killed his ex-wife to hide the theft of more than $300,000 from their children's trust fund accounts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the eligibility of parole in 2009 on charges of first-degree murder for financial gain, tax evasion, embezzlement, grand theft, and perjury. During his preliminary hearing, Hawk attacked a photographer and faced additional charges for battery. During his trial, a loan consultant said Hawk falsely filled out a loan form to refinance his mortgage. In it, he listed his children as employees of a business he claimed he owned. All 3 of their children testified during trial as well. During the process, Conrad appeared to believe his father was definitely guilty, but Savannah and Chelsea did not. On March 18, 2016, 10 years after she vanished, skeletal remains were found by 2 farmers in a field off 16th Avenue south of Lemoore, near Stratford. Dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Debbie. Following the discovery, prosecutors and Hawk's attorney agreed to preserve the remains for DNA testing. The condition of the remains and the significant time period that they were exposed to the elements severely compromised any chance of locating the DNA profile of a perpetrator. Authorities also said that Hawk was familiar with the area where the remains were found, as he had worked farm jobs nearby. As of today, Hawk remains at Corcoran Prison in California, the same prison that housed Charles Manson until his death in 2017. In 1983, 25-year-old recently divorced Marsha Carter was living in San Francisco Bay Area in California with her 4 sons aged 11, 9, 7, and 10 months. Marsha worked as a purchasing agent for a manufacturing firm and had been a singer with a local rock band. On the morning of December 7, 1983, her 3 oldest sons woke up to find their mother missing and did not see their baby brother. The boys went to a neighbor's house for help, and the neighbor came over and found 10-month-old Antoine safe underneath her bed. They shockingly found her bed was covered in blood and a knife was stuck in her pillow. Sadly, 10 days later, Marsha was discovered stabbed to death 70 miles away in the trunk of her own car in a Sacramento hotel parking lot. Marsha had previously dated a man a few months prior named Cheryl Smothers that lived near her. The couple had broken up multiple times, and her sons remembered the 2 often arguing, and one of her sons recalled his mother slamming the door in Smothers' face. He also said that his mother had told the boys that if Smothers came near them, for them to run. Police suspected Smothers murdered Marsha, but said they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. Over the years, Travis Carter said he heard people suspected his father, who was also his youngest brother's father. 10-month-old Antoine had a different father, but the boys always suspected Smothers. As police searched for her whereabouts, an acquaintance of Smothers, Calvin Featherson, came forward with a shocking story. Featherson told police that weeks earlier, Smothers had offered him $500 to help him kill Marsha. He said Smothers told him he wanted to break into Marsha's home, kill her, and dump her body in a Sacramento hotel parking lot. He said Smothers showed him a map of Sacramento and pointed to a hotel parking lot where he wanted to dump the body, which is exactly where she was eventually found. He said he didn't hear from Smothers for a few days, then turned on the news one night and realized Marsha was a missing person and apologized that he didn't go to the police sooner. Smothers was questioned about the killing in 1983 and told investigators he had an alibi. He'd gone out for ice cream with a friend. The friend, who Featherson said Smothers also recruited, backed up the alibi. But Featherson's word on its own wasn't enough to charge Smothers with a crime. Featherson agreed to secretly record conversations between the 2. In one, Smothers asked if Featherson had told police about the maps, but never confessed to killing Marsha. Marsha's oldest son, Dante, kept encouraging the police to reopen his mother's case, which they eventually did. However, DNA technology was not available until 2001, and the investigation did not begin until 2008 because of a backlog of evidence, and Smothers was not identified as a suspect until 2015. Then, nearly 33 years after her murder, police announced that they arrested 54-year-old Cheryl Smothers in Marsha's murder. In 1988, 5 years after Marsha's death, Smothers became a quadriplegic and confined to a wheelchair. He was driving his Corvette with his wife and infant son as passengers. They were hit by a drunk driver, and Smothers' neck was crushed, damaging his spinal cord. He sued General Motors, alleging the design of his vehicle was faulty, and won $6 million in the lawsuit. Featherston testified against Smothers during the trial. He said that he was planning to tell police about Smothers' scheme before Marsha was killed, but he was worried they wouldn't believe him. He said his plan was to get the $500, then tell police and show them the money as evidence. Marsha's son, Travis, said Featherston has apologized to him and his brothers for not coming forward to police before their mother was killed. In the years that followed their mother's death, the boys worried that Smothers would either come after them or pay someone to kill them as well. On September 18, 2018, the jury notified the judge they had all come to an agreement and had a verdict. However, when court was back in session, Smothers was nowhere to be found, even after telling his attorney he was on his way. After he was a no-show, a bench warrant would be issued for his arrest. An inspector from the DA's office would finally locate Smothers at his home in Granite Bay and took him into custody. His attorney would claim that Smothers had a panic attack after learning the jury had a verdict and somehow fell into the swimming pool in his backyard. He then managed to pull himself out and crawl to a phone. Once back in court, the jury would find him guilty and he would be sentenced to 25 years to life. In 2021, after being in prison for 3 years, an appeals court overturned the conviction against Smothers. They stated that Smothers' attorney made mistakes based on his own misconceptions, which may have given a false impression about the state of DNA evidence. While Smothers was tied to the crime by blood matching his DNA found in Marsha's bedroom, DNA evidence under Marsha's fingernails was actually matched to a Wisconsin man named Kevin Sennett, who had no apparent connection to Smothers, Marsha, or anyone else suspected in the killing. Kevin Sennett was identified after the DNA was entered into CODIS. He was an Army reservist whose wife believed that he had taken a trip to California in 1983 because he came back from a road trip with a Raiders jacket. However, Kevin Sennett stated that he had never been to California. The appellate court stated that Smothers' attorney inexplicably decided to keep Sennett's name from the jury. Instead, his lawyer only told jurors that an unknown man's DNA had been found under the victim's fingernails, but never mentioned the man by name. The lawyer later explained that he had no good faith reason to place the man in California. The appellate stated this could have led jurors to falsely assume that the person was possibly Smothers. Shortly after the trial, defense investigators found evidence that Sennett had in fact traveled to California in late 1983 looking for work. Smothers denied any involvement in the killing, and there was no evidence that he had any contact with Sennett. As of today, nobody is in prison for killing Marsha, and a new trial is yet to be underway.